I want to welcome Tim Skellett, who I saw on Twitter, and to be very honest, I have no clue what you are actually doing as some sort of a job or anything. I just know that your Twitter account is enormously interesting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. That's very, very kind of you.
Well, one of the reasons we're having this call, and as we've already talked about, is that, well, you're from Great Britain, but you were born at the time when Great Britain was still an empire. And so you weren't born in what we would say Great Britain.
That was true, but it was also exactly the time that Britain had decided not to be an empire, that it had decided officially not to be an empire. And
Yes, there was a process of devolution that had been
yeah,
going on for several decades back then.
but it was very, very deliberate. After the 1956 Suez War, Britain made official policy to withdraw troops, to withdraw troops, to turn over government to the peoples in questions, to get rid of their colonies. And in some cases, it wasn't necessarily all that great a result for various different reasons.
Yes.
But it was an interesting, tense time. But much more than that, it was a very tense time for completely different reasons. But I'll let you continue. You wanted to ask some questions, so I can hear that. So how about I'll let you ask them?
It was a time when England had already lost the colonies in India, of course, back in 1947.
Yeah.
And what you are referring to is, of course, that a lot of the governments were woefully underprepared to actually assume any kind of government roles in the colonies, or then free states, actually.
Yeah, more than that, there was also, of course, a lot of corruption, a lot of authoritarianism, a lot of sheer opportunism. And of course, you had the civil war between Pakistan and India. If you want to call it a civil war, or the war of separation, whatever you prefer to call it. But I don't know that anybody could have done any differently. You understand me?
Yes.
The moral argument was simply too big. How dare you have colonies? And the moral argument was fairly forceful, because there's a hell of a lot behind it. A hell of a lot of truth behind it. Yeah?
Yes, by that time it certainly was. It was just that it came too late. The realization that that having the colonies is a big problem from a moral standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. But the real tension came from the not quite sure how to call this, but we'll call it the East-West divide, the Cold War. That's where the real tension came from. You had the awful racist regime in South Africa, okay?
Yeah.
And Tanzania, where I lived, was basically on the front line, even though it'd been nowhere near South Africa. And it was right on the front line for two different reasons. One is it's next to Mozambique, which was going through a very, very vicious war, which was a civil war and an anti-colonial war at the same time.
Yes, it was part of Portugal at that time, wasn't it?
Precisely. It was a Portuguese colony.
Well, they weren't calling it a colony. They said they were a pluricontinental country. They were a country on several continents.
Yes, to a degree, but their idea of being a country was somewhat, let's say, self-serving. Yeah?
Yes.
They took all the profits out. Yeah. Their war to keep the colonies in Africa, it became genocidal in Mozambique, in northern Mozambique. It became genocidal. There were whole villages wiped out. But equally on the other side, Frelimo, the anti-Portuguese guerrillas. They were incredibly vicious themselves. And the whole war in Angola became vicious as well, etc. But in any case, I lived, for example, roughly 8 miles away from a Frelimo training camp. And at that time, BOSS, B-O-S-S, Bureau of State Security in South Africa, the secret police there, they were sending parcel bombs and letter bombs to any anti-apartheid campaigners, big ones. So the father of a friend of mine, of a childhood friend of mine, was killed by such a parcel bomb sent by the South African secret police. So there was a lot of fear and paranoia and rage going on. Then you had the whole mess in the Congo, where the Belgians really ran a terrible regime, or had a terrible history.
Yeah, they had a terrible history. It got a lot better, but only because it was absolutely appalling during the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, the war itself was absolutely terrible as well. And so it ended up that what in ordinary circumstances would be called a terrible time ended up being a sort of a golden age for the Congo, the good old times, just before the war.
Yes, I agree with you completely. And you're extremely well informed. Yeah.
Well, it's all down to Anthony Bourdain having shown, the very first time that he had his show Parts Unknown, it was on the Congo, and I remember that one particularly.
Well, right, because, for example, I often am careful about where I say where I grew up, because the reaction I get from a lot of idiots here in Germany and in Britain or in America is, they think I grew up in some racist regime. They think I grew up in something like South Africa. They have no idea about Africa. My childhood was in a black, socialist, African-ruled country, yeah?
Okay.
With a black socialist government. Very famous President Nyerere, yeah? He decided on a socialist program. He was friends with East Germany, etc., 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 with China. In actual fact, he did it quite cleverly. He used to play off the great powers against each other. He used to play off the US against Russia, against China, etc.
Yeah, that was par for the course for any somewhat successful country that didn't descend into utter madness, to play off one against the other and hope to somehow get out.
Yep. And it was very tense. So there was rage about the Congo, even in Tanzania. I met a very pale echo of that rage about the Congo. Oddly enough, a couple of years ago, down in the south of Tanzania, where I met a local right down to the south west corner of Tanzania, who sang about the liberation war in the Congo. I found it a bit ironic because, as you pointed out yourself, the civil wars which came afterwards recently, especially as a result of the Rwandan Hutus, they're moving into the Congo and the entire destabilization, but also the Mobutu regime, the incredible corruption and tribalism, etc. They make the more recent Belgian history look mild, look tame. Maybe they don't make King Leopold look tame, and nothing could make King Leopold's robbery of the country look tame, because that was vicious. I mean, he made the Nazis look almost tame. Seriously.
Yes, the one thing that helps him is oblivion.
Yes.
People just forgot about him.
Yes, and his dreadful policies. I mean, when you see the photos of the piles of hands which have been chopped off to encourage people to pay up their taxes, So either they pay their taxes or they lost a hand. And you see these piles of hands in the photos.
Yeah.
And you think, my God. In any case, so when I grew up as a child, it was very tense and paranoid times. While I never then experienced great hatred myself, I experienced a little, and I've known at least one man who was very lucky not to be shot by a firing squad because they thought he was a spy. It was very, very tense times. As I told you, the father of a childhood friend of mine was killed by a bomb sent by the racist South African secret police.
Yeah.
And people were incredibly paranoid at times, and sometimes you really can't blame them. Yeah, there were strange times, and they were really vicious, and they were terribly mixed up.
Yeah.
In any case, I'm sorry, my apologies. I'm going on a bit.
No, it's quite okay. It's quite okay. I've never heard a lot of those stories.
Okay, to give you an idea about my background, I grew up in the back country of Tanzania. You do find people who lived in Tanzania, but they lived in places like Dar es Salaam, and often in what they call the expat enclaves. Expat means short for expatriate,
Yes.
meaning the foreigner enclaves. I never lived in the foreign enclaves. My family always lived in the very remote parts of Tanzania, and we did not have electricity for most of my childhood, for example. For most of my childhood we had no electricity, which meant reading after dark was almost impossible, because you try reading for a long time by the light of a pressure lamp or by a kerosene lamp. Yeah?
To be honest, I've never had one of those.
You're lucky.
Probably.
They are not fun. And
they're not fun and quite sooty, I think.
Yes, and they're also quite painful to try reading by after a while. Also, we had no refrigeration at all, and that's a big thing. If you have no way of keeping food cold in a hot climate, then you have to have a diet which is very rich in salt, because you have to use salt to preserve things, and a diet very, very high in curry, because curry is also used as a preservative for food. Yeah? So I'm used to incredibly hot food, because it was the only way of keeping stuff halfway edible. Okay, what else would you like me to tell you? What else can I tell you? I don't want to bore you with what you might find as irrelevancies.
It is very hard to judge what is relevant and what is not, because it's almost impossible to judge, because I don't know about your life. I don't really know a lot about Tanzania itself. I don't know a lot about the circumstances. I don't know a lot about the people who are living there. I barely know that it was a British colony. So yes, well, there's almost nothing that I could judge as being irrelevant.
Okay, well, Tanzania itself has a long and fascinating history. You know, it was a German colony. You know, it's the only place where the Germans actually won World War I, amazingly enough, in a very peculiar and very interesting war. It was also partly an Arab colony for a long while, the coast.
Yeah, Dar es Salaam itself is giving it away in a way.
Yes, and it was a native empire. If you look at the old empire, centered around Kilwa, down at the south of Tanzania on the coast, and then later on Zanzibar, you're looking at the local Swahili island empire with colonies on the coast. Yeah, and the Swahili are an African people with an Arab overlay, you might say, and with Persian influence. Kilwa, the beautiful island of Kilwa with its magnificent ruins, I don't know if you saw the photos I tweeted of the ruins on Kilwa. They are beautiful and they are magnificent. They're 1,000 years old and they're so well preserved. And they were started off by a tiny group of Persians, very, very oddly enough. 40 Persians skipped out of Persia for various reasons and decided to try going and finding a place where they could settle and build up a little colony of their own. And they bought some land. They bought some land on the island off the coast of Kilwa. There are 3 different Kilwas. One is a large town right on the coast. One is a small fishing village. And then there's the island. They're all right next to each other. But there's Kilwa Kisawani, Kilwa Kavinji, which is a small village, and Kilwa Masoko, which is the large town on the coast. And then you've got the island of Kilwa Kisawani. There's now a fishing village on it, a small fishing village on it. When I was a child, nobody lived there. And you just have these huge ruins. If you look at through my tweets for Kilwa,
it must have been like the people who lived in Rome after the Roman Empire fell down, and
yes,
Rome was essentially deserted.
That, yes, and more than that. What I found very interesting was, I visited for the very first time for many decades. I visited Tanzania in 2012. It was my very first visit since my childhood. Okay. And so for me, the saying, the past is a foreign country. Well, that's doubly true in my case. And it's very, very far away. It's different. It's something incredibly different. The population of Tanzania has more than tripled in my lifetime. The population of Australia has more than doubled in my lifetime. I'm going to send you a link now here on Twitter.
Okay.
To show you the photos of Kilwa, because I'd like to give you an idea about the ancient empires there. It was a fascinating state. And you can look through those and see what I mean by the massive and beautiful ruins which are 1,000 years old. There are a couple of photos, first of all, of Kilwa Kavinji, the fishing village on the coast. So don't confuse that with the island, okay?
Yeah, it takes a little while to load, but yeah, now I'm getting them. Yes.
Okay, but now you see the photos of ruins, and those are all on Kilwa Kisawani, the island, and they are beautiful and totally magnificent. They are huge. The palace at Kilwa is huge. It was an incredibly rich island empire with connections to Oman and connections to other Arab trucial states. So they shared a kind of dynasty with Oman on, next to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
They had trading with Indonesia, with the Philippines, with all those islands up there.
Yeah.
With India. They were a Swahili empire who was started by Persians and then theoretically, and it's only theoretically, taken over by Arabs. They ran a slave trading empire where they shipped slaves out, mainly to Saudi Arabia and Iraq, mainly in the Iraq region. For example, in the 7th century AD, there was a rebellion by 1.5 million slaves in Iraq. They rebelled.
Now that's huge at that time. That's
yes.
Absolute huge.
And that's only the ones who rebelled, in Iraq.
Okay. So, let me gather that. 7th century, that is just after the rise of Islam. And
Yep, or just before it.
Or just before it, yeah. Yeah. So it was not yet part of the Islamic empires, or was it?
No, it wasn't. Iraq would have
Okay.
been a very mixed state at that time, but the Arab slave trade was huge, and it went on for well over 2,000 years. First of all, of course, you had the Egyptians with their own slave trade, but that was not all that big, because so they usually stuck to the Sudan, yeah?
Yeah.
But the Arabs coming out from what you'd call the Middle East, the Red Sea area, and the Persians from Iran, they built up a huge slave trade, and it makes the slave trade to the Americans look small. Seriously. It makes it really look very, very small. At the same time,
I had heard about that, but it was in the context essentially of World War II propaganda or something like that. No. It was a bit in the context of German colonial propaganda. You know, where they
yes.
said, yeah, it doesn't matter whether we are there and use their work, or whether it's the Arabs. But I had never heard it was a really seriously big deal at any point.
Oh, it was.
Okay.
It was. There's still a lot of hatred of the Arabs in hinterland Tanzania, not on the coast. Now, Tanzania is a very split country in many ways. The coast is Muslim, because it's settled mainly by the Swahili people, if you want to call them a tribe or whatever.
Yeah.
They're very Islamic, and I wanted to tell you a story about that in Kilwa in a moment, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
And then you have Muslims inland as well, around the areas around Iringa and around Arusha. So, for example,
where is that roughly?
Okay, Iringa. One moment, and I'll send you another map.
Yeah, that would be helpful. I should have prepared myself. You're right.
No problems. I am more than helpful myself. Okay, we'll try that and we'll see how we go. Now, that's in the hinterland of Tanzania, but Iringa, the town I'm talking about, is a fascinating area because it was a town built from scratch by the Germans.
Okay.
It was built by the Germans as a fort because they were fighting a local chief right next door. And his main town, if you want to call it that, was right there. He had a big fort there with quite strong walls made from mud brick. And he was a very, very fierce chieftain. He led a very strong war against the Germans for quite a long while. He was a slave trader himself, etc. But he's looked upon, of course, as a local hero in the district because, of course, he belongs to the tribe there in the local district. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, they're mostly Muslims, but you have the very odd effect of Iringa being a Christian town surrounded by a Muslim countryside, which is interesting. And then, to give you another idea of the history, you have a colony area quite far away in the Congo. You have an area deep inland in the Congo where they speak Swahili, where they speak a version of Swahili. And the reason for that is the Arab slave traders. They moved in from the coast of Kenya and Tanzania. They had their caravan routes through Tanzania right into the Congo for ivory. Okay?
Yeah.
And so you have an area inside the Congo, deep inside the Congo, where they speak Swahili. And nobody speaks Swahili around about it. The Congo has quite different languages. They're related, but very different. So you get an idea of the
extent of
yes,
the operation. Yeah.
The immense reach. And the Arab slave trade on East Africa was hideous. As I said, there's still a lot of anger there because it killed so many people. But the Muslims also tend to see it as part of their glorious heritage, more or less. When I visited Kilwa Kiswani, the island, I told you there's a small fishing village there. I was fascinated to see locals praying in the ruined mosques. You've seen the photos I sent you.
Yeah.
Should I send you a link to Kilwa as well, or can you find that by yourself?
I've just found it.
Okay, my apologies. As you can see, there's an island off the coast called Kilwa Kiswani, then the town called Kilwa Masoko on the coast.
I'm seeing a town called Kilwa Kivinji. Yeah. Okay, Masoka and yeah. Okay, I think I got it.
Okay, Kivinji is a small fishing village. If you look at the photos I sent you, the first two photos in the page I sent you, with sort of small huts, okay, or houses with thatched roofs, facing a bay filled with fishing boats. That's Kilwa Kivinji.
Okay.
Then if you look, next row there's a photo through an arched window bay. There's no window in the bay, it's just an arched bay in the wall, a house wall looking out onto that same bay. Can you see that?
The very first, the second picture I see is of a sailing boat.
Okay.
That's the second one. The one next is out of a window.
Okay. Then looking out that window is fascinating because it is the German colonial headquarters. It is a beautiful building. If you look down through, it doesn't show them well. It doesn't show you all my photos there, which is a huge pity. I'll try finding your photo by direct search in a moment. That building is beautiful. It's constructed really well by the Germans, and it still exists, but it's in terrible condition because it was not looked after at all. Okay? When the British took over Tanzania at the end of the First World War, they deliberately moved their own district headquarters from Kivinji to Masoko. And so they neglected Kivinji completely.
Yeah.
And actually it's quite bad for Tanzania as a whole, the British decisions. For example, German scientific research in Tanganyika, as it was back then, was very, very good. It was leading research in the world. And the British completely neglected it. They stopped it. Scientific research in Tanzania did not recover till 1964, roughly. Okay? So from 1918 to 1964, you have this huge period in which there's almost no research being done in Tanzania. It's a huge pity. Okay, so back to the story I was telling you. When I went to these ruins, where you see the ruined mosques and the ruined palace, I was fascinated to see local men by themselves, not in groups, praying for very long times in these mosques, these ruined mosques. And I think they're constructing a new identity and heritage for themselves, yeah?
Yeah.
The glories of the past and appealing to the glories of the past. The Saudi Arabians, of course, pump a lot of money into new mosque building in the rest of Tanzania. When you drive around the hinterland, quite often the only good buildings you see made out of concrete, right? Rather than the local usual mud brick. They're very new big mosques, and they're built with Saudi Arabian money because of the drive to Islamicize. You know, anywhere where there's an Islamic community, the Saudi Arabians pump in money, first of all to drive their own Wahhabite particular strand of Islam, okay, and also to increase the number of Muslims, etc., etc., etc.
Well, it reminds me that there are a lot of Chinese currently investing in Africa, building infrastructure and so on. How much of that is going on there?
In Tanzania, not so much, but it is a huge problem in the other parts of Africa because
it's not a problem. It's a problem.
Oh, but it's big in
Okay.
two different ways. One, the Chinese don't give a stuff about corruption or human rights. They will throw money at you if they think you have a strategic investment worthwhile to them, which is basically raw ores, yeah? So you have raw earth metals, etc., etc. Things like this. The Chinese are trying to build up complete independence plus power, and they are throwing money around like wild, while the Americans in the West are now finally beginning to insist that corruption should be reduced if the people want aid money. And it is incredibly important. Aid money, international aid money, is the biggest part of the Tanzanian budget by far. It is a huge part of the whole budget of the country. Without that international aid, Tanzania would fall apart, literally.
Yeah. Well, and that is usually a really big problem in and of itself.
Yes.
When a country cannot sustain itself by its own means.
Precisely. Moreover, it leads to the interesting thing: taxpayers have a stake in being involved. If you pay tax, you want to know where your bloody money is going to. Okay?
Yeah.
If the country is not being run really on tax of its own citizens,
Yeah,
they're not involved.
From the money from outside, then of course nobody will really see the point in paying taxes, because all the money usually just comes from foreign countries.
That's not the problem. The problem is they're also not involved politically. They don't see the point in being involved politically because they don't have their own tax money involved in it.
Yeah.
And this is a terrible problem in West Africa, for example, where you have big natural resources like oil.
Yeah.
Then the government will rely on the oil and neglect its citizens. Its citizens won't be politically involved, won't be politically active, and if anything, they'll be oppressed. Okay?
Yeah.
So back to Tanzania, my apologies. Sorry, no, actually back to the rest of Africa, not Tanzania. The other Chinese problem I wanted to discuss is huge, and it's not the Chinese government per se, it's individuals. And it is actually colonialism. There are huge numbers of Chinese individuals settling in Africa to make a much better living for themselves than in China. And this is becoming a great big problem. You have to understand, well, Africa, every region on earth has always been subject to people swapping around, okay?
Yeah.
I mean, you look at the Germans.
Much more so than these days in Europe, where just moving people around people moving around seems to be an odd thing, even though it used to be extremely common.
Precisely. You had the different German tribes, never quite sure of where they were, and, always thinking maybe they'd prefer to be somewhere else, okay?
Yeah, right now I'm a little north of Saxony, and of course the Saxons came from the northwest of Germany. Yep. So, yeah, what we call Saxony, where we think that the Saxons seem to be coming from, is absolutely not the place where they came from. They came from the sea, essentially.
Yes.
And it's mind-boggling in a way, because for a very long time I absolutely didn't realize that at all, that the Saxons were coming from what we call Niedersachsen and not Sachsen. It's just strange to think of it.
Precisely. Absolutely.
And that's a minor thing, actually. It's nothing compared to the Goths or whatever, the Celtic people, or you can name whatever you want, the Celtic people whom we associate with Scotland or Ireland, and who are actually a big problem in Italy and whatnot.
And they actually burnt down the library in Timbuktu as well. It was Germanics who burnt down the library in Timbuktu, which I thought was terribly uncivilized of them and very bad of them. But I assume that eventually they got wiped out or disappeared. But they definitely got places. I mean, they never seem to have settled. Anyway, back to the point. My apologies. So, you have huge numbers of Chinese settling in Africa, and this will create huge tensions.
Yes.
If you remember Idi Amin in Uganda and how he played upon xenophobia towards the Indian, and how all the Ugandan Asians were expelled from Uganda at once, and all of a sudden 20,000 Ugandan Asians wanted to go to Britain. That caused a great big problem at the time itself.
Yeah, well, 25,000 seems to be almost a minor problem compared to the extraordinary amounts of people who moved during the decolonization period from Africa and all over the world into Europe. The point is that when the Portuguese colonies became independent, 1 million Portuguese people moved back into Portugal. It's such a tiny country, and it must have been huge. It must have been such a big problem for that little country. And France, the same thing. Over 1 million people moving from Algeria into France in a matter of 3 months. And I mean, sometimes I'm thinking of it, and I think, well, maybe during that time, a lot of the current xenophobia and the current fear of just many foreigners coming into a country kind of started to become as extreme as it seems to be these days.
Yep, and these social problems can become huge. So eventually there will be a lot of anger from the locals because they will feel outdone in business by the Chinese, for example, and they will start feeling resentful about the rich Chinese, etc. It is becoming ever more a problem. It's a two-step thing. One is the Chinese government and their habit of basically encouraging and enabling corruption and oppression. Yeah? That's exactly what they do. And the other thing is, Chinese individuals settling down in Africa in big ways, and that will cause problems. But that second problem is not so much a problem in Tanzania itself, where there are not that many Chinese at all. You'll find them in Mozambique, you'll find them in other parts of Africa right next to Tanzania, but not so much in Tanzania itself. Yeah?
Yep.
I just sent you another link showing you part of that building with the cannon outside.
Yeah.
And in terribly ruined state. I remember as a child seeing that cannon in good shape and painted up. Yeah? Okay. Now it's ruined. There's rubble outside that building. The only good thing about the building is its roof. They put on a new roof on it a couple of years ago out of Blecheisen, Blechwelleneisen, corrugated iron, yeah?
Yeah.
Which is really necessary. It is a beautiful building. It really deserves preservation. And I really wanted to get in contact with German Africanistic and history people to see what could be done about saving it.
And at this point we digressed from the topic. There will be a second part, and we will talk again as well. At this point we digressed from the topic. There will be a second part, and we will talk again as well. See you then.